Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. And Mr. Eddie, I did want to say that, Mr. Eddie, I wanted to say Bloomberg is also celebrating our 30th anniversary in Hong Kong. So we've been here as long as HKMA, so it's a good year for us. And you're invited to all our celebrations as well. In any case, thank you for joining us this morning for this panel on sharing the wealth. So according to McKinsey Global Institute, the world is wealthier than ever before, with its net worth tripling from 2000 to 2020. And in Asia Pacific, the wealth has grown fourfold, with the region now accounting for some 42% of global wealth. And Mr. Nuno Matos just said, it's going to be bigger than the entire West in the next 2 years. So, yet our philanthropic giving is not keeping up. Why? According to the research by the Center for Asian Philanthropy and Society that Ruth leads, over $700 billion per year of this wealth in Asia could be activated for good if we were to match the US in terms of philanthropic spend. So Ruth, I'd like to start with you. What is holding us back? What are the fundamental differences in how philanthropy might be carried out in Asia? And what do you see as really things we could do to move the needle?
Well, thank you very much for the question, and thank you, Bloomberg, for inviting me to the stage. And thank all of you. The light is bright, so I'm assuming that you look enraptured and interested in everything we have to say, since I can't see you. But let me just say, we use words like philanthropy, foundations, donations, as if they mean exactly the same thing all over the world. And in fact, it works differently in Asia. So we have to realize, yes, Asia is home to 60% of the world's population. Right now, 40% of the world's wealth. But aside from a few countries and economies, Korea, Singapore, Japan, and Taiwan, Asia is still primarily emerging markets, low and medium income, which means that they have different challenges than you would have in Europe and the United States. We also know that in Asia, 85% of all companies are still family dominated, and that is true from SMEs up to the big corporations. So that has pretty profound implications. When you think about philanthropy in the United States, for example, you think of Ford and Gates and Rockefeller foundations. But in Asia, there aren't any of those. Most of the money is routed through the company. And so what you get is, a kind of a merging of philanthropy, personal philanthropy, CSR, local knowledge, R&D, and business development together. We actually feel that that's actually a pretty sustainable model, because when you create those win-win types of scenarios, then the project or the intervention or the product even is more likely to be carried on and not bound up in the interests of a particular person in a particular moment.
And is there anything that you think we could do to kind of accelerate?
Well, I think all over the world, the traditional demarcations between the government, the private sector, and the social sector are morphing, right? There is such incredible pressure on companies to do more, to do ESG, to care about the community, to engage in solutions. We polled a number of ultra-high net worth individuals, and 88% said that they see public-private partnerships for social good increasing. So that's the private sector, be it philanthropy or CSR, working in collaboration with government to solve a problem, right? PPPs used to be about creating toll roads and ports. Now they're about education and healthcare and others, in addition to ports and toll roads. So I think that there is not a company in the world today, really, that can choose not to care about these issues. And that is changing fundamentally. Now, of course, we have the situation in India where the government has said 2% of the top about 18,000 companies have to the top 18,000 companies have to give 2% of pre-tax money to CSR.
Correct.
So it's happening. I mean, that's a lot of money going into the social sector in India. And whether there's a government mandate or not, other companies are feeling the need to engage in that way. So I see the change coming. There is a lot more interest. There's a lot more activity. So I think the notion of catching up with the West is a little bit of a misnomer. I think things are happening differently. The money is being spent, but it may not be being captured in the same way, partially because we don't know. There's not enough transparency and accountability to know how much money is being spent.
Yeah, and as you said, it's very integrated to the business and often happens in your backyard, as Annabel and I was speaking right before this. So I want to turn to you, Annabel. I mean, again, we heard from Mr. Matos that HSBC is now the biggest and the best in Asia. As you continue to grow in the region, right, I'm sure you're being asked for more advice, more support, especially as Ruth said, this is very family dominated. In terms of serving your customers, are there any particular trends you're seeing, or are they really asking for more?
Look, I think there's a lot of good news here. And as Nuno says, we have a tremendous presence across Asia. And at this end of the space, particularly in philanthropy, we've really invested across Asia to be able to support our clients. And we've invested in our business. So dramatic growth in China, in Thailand, we're launching in India next year. So we're speaking really from a position of strength and really understanding the market for philanthropy when I say this. The news is really good because we're getting this question from our clients. We're getting it more than we've ever had. And I'm not sure if that's stimulated by COVID or just a realization of the importance of humanity or what's happening in climate change, but we're getting a lot of interest in philanthropy. And Hong Kong, with its multi-generational wealth and pockets of Singapore and obviously pockets of Southeast Asia, they've been there for a while. And there's some really good examples of multi-generational foundations there that have made a real impact. But in the newer wealth, as you talked about, some of the markets that have been emerging, and let me just pick China for an example, we're seeing a lot of interest. And to give some statistics to that, what we've seen for families and individuals with over $1 billion RMB, we've seen that investment in philanthropy triple over the last 5 years, according to the Center of Philanthropic Research. And that's really important. But I'd like to just echo some of the themes that Ruth talked about with Asian giving, because there are some really important themes that do differentiate it from Europe and the US. And the first theme is that Asian giving tends to be very tangible. It's very aligned to societal aims, to community aims. It's very aligned to government expectations. And that's a mix of emerging markets and not being the gap to UN and basically development goals. So a lot of that investment's going into health, it's going into education, it's going into the really basic social infrastructure and close to the communities that have supported the givers. That's a really important trend. Also, Asians tend to work closely in their communities to really give back to their communities. So it's quite tangible. You see less of the policy and the advocacy sort of giving that you see from a Ford Foundation or from the Gates. It's much more tangible. And I think that's really encouraging, particularly when you look at the needs of the communities that we're dealing with. In North Asia, it's a lot about education, and it's evolving from basic education up until mental health of students, increasingly important through COVID, teacher quality. In South Asia, it's health, it's sanitation, it's really improving living conditions, particularly in India as we look at pollution and things like that. So some very important trends. I agree with Ruth also that it does tend to be in Asia through the corporation. A little bit of an evolution towards endowments, particularly in more sophisticated markets. Hong Kong, Singapore, as you heard from Eddie, definitely encouraging family offices and encouraging endowments. That's very encouraging. And the final thing, you can't talk about Asian philanthropy without talking about next gen and millennials. That is creating a surge of interest in philanthropy, and that's incredibly exciting. And I think it's changing the shape of philanthropy, and it will change it a lot in Asia.
Thank you. That's great. I actually want to pick up on a couple of things both of you said. You know, one trend that I've noticed, and I'm sure a lot of people in this room must have noticed, that there's a lot of more conversation around impact investing, blended finance, and how this next generation, and I know you both touched on that, are really changing the way they do business. So they're really bringing purpose to their business, to their investment portfolios, to their philanthropy. So it's not really separate anymore, right? It's very much a holistic view. And in fact, the Impact was launched, I think, in 2016 by a group of visionary families to do just that, right? Align their assets to their values. So if I can ask, for both of you to share your experience around that. I know, for example, you touched on climate and how that can be integrated into some of their decisions, both in the business but also in the philanthropic giving. And then I'll come back to you, Ruth.
I think the first question that we ask any of our clients, and particularly families, is what's their why? And that's not just about their philanthropy, that's about themselves, understanding what they want to invest in, how do they feel about their health, their well-being, their communities, the world. That why used to be, in particular in philanthropy, about investing back in that community that supported them. But what we're hearing now is that why is changing to a purpose and to a passion. And that's changing the where of where they're investing and where their philanthropy is going. And that where might be expressed particularly when we look at next gen, and they are more considerably looking at this, and also millennials, that where is turning outwards and it's turning global. It's turning towards the environment and the things that they see as pressing changes. And we're seeing that come through in their investments. First, actually, in their businesses. You know, we're having lots of conversations around energy transition, recycling waste in hotel chains. So we'll talk about their businesses. Then we'll talk about their investments and whether that's excluding certain things that they don't want to invest in, or putting an ESG thematic through their investments, or particularly thematics they might want to put in, or sometimes it's concentrated investments for impact. So really investing to change certain aspects. So investing in battery research, et cetera, for the purposes of a commercial return. When we get to the how, though, of philanthropy, that's a really interesting blend, because suddenly we're looking at business, investment, philanthropy, and impact investing in particular, in a continuum. And what philanthropy gives our families and our individuals and our endowments a chance to do is to really look at their impact investing in a philanthropic view, and start to look at impact investing as catalytic capital. Capital being invested that may or may not get a financial return and therefore is more at the philanthropic end, but can change the world. So that may be in very high-risk energy transition. It may be in investing in social enterprise that will become sustainable later, but that capital otherwise will not go in. But it's often with a sustainability lens. And banks have a really important role to play in this, in the infrastructure of this. So if you look at what HSBC, for example, has done with Temasek in our partnership there, we've created a business there that supports green energy debt financing, primarily in Southeast Asia initially. And what HSBC has also contributed is $100 million of philanthropic capital to provide an underpinning to that, to really lift that impact investing aspect, that philanthropic capital, to encourage private capital to invest on top of that, and then debt finance on top of that, to really transform things. And I think that, as we think about it, is absolutely essential.
You know, this is music to my ears, because, I mean, if all asset managers could talk about, and wealth managers could talk about legacy, overall and integrate the business with the giving. I mean, we've been we're moving towards the right direction. And as Mike Bloomberg always says, right, it's the risk capital of philanthropy. You cannot replace that because the outcome, it's catalytic. But Ruth, turning over to you, I was actually reading that CAPS has done a wonderful paper on blended finance and it being a win-win strategy to pool public and private funds. And you talked about that at the beginning. Can you share a little bit more on that, especially from an environment or climate perspective?
I'm happy to, but let me just address one point that Annabel just made. We actually don't see that much interest in cross-border giving. Why? Because people aren't connected to a place. Also, there are now 8 out of the 18 economies that we study in our Doing Good Index that actually have regulatory hurdles that prevent money from going out and coming in. So 1, they may not want to, but 2, they cannot. So I always think about it, one key difference between the East and the West, so to speak, is that in the East, particularly in the United States, people get up and they say, here's the problem I want to solve. I want to solve for climate change. I want to solve for the inadequacy of vaccines. I want to solve for whatever it is. And in Asia, people tend to say, this is the community I want to help. And I'm a little bit more agnostic as to how to help them. But I will use the resources, the knowledge, and the understanding of my company, of my network, of my family to address those needs. Now, what I see is, and it's a pragmatic approach, and since we're up here, I will plug my own book called Pragmatic Philanthropy, which gets to Annabel's point about tangible. People think, what is within my remit that I can really solve? And I'm not taking the place of government, I'm working alongside government, because in Asia, it is critical to work with government, not counter to government. These are all, after all, the people in this room and the people listening are in business and want to stay in business. So you work with government, not against government. In terms of new trends, absolutely. If you think that families are very involved in philanthropy and businesses are family dominated, then the people at the top, they're not making a distinction. They're seeing, okay, I have my personal money, I have the CSR of the company, I have these resources which I will deploy in the following ways. So the notion of blended finance, of using different pots of capital toward solving a problem, toward building a business, is very much part of the DNA of this part of the world. And let me give you an example of working with government and of using all of those resources. When Xi Jinping announced the poverty alleviation scheme that took place between 2015 and 2020, where the government of China succeeded in alleviating absolute poverty, Alibaba stepped up. And what did they do? They took the personal philanthropy, not all of it, but some of it, of the 30 founders, including Jack Ma, but not only Jack Ma. They took the CSR of Alibaba, they took R&D, they took business development, and they also were able to essentially work with local government funding to create $1 billion fund to alleviate poverty. So they went into the poorest parts of China and they helped farmers and small businesses scale up, improve the quality, improve the quantity, and put them on the Taobao site. That helped Taobao, it helped Alibaba, and it helped all these people get out of poverty, not for the short term, but over the long term. And that's a brilliant example of how it's going to work, aligned with government and using multiple resources to solve a problem.
On a sustainable basis.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because it's a real partnership. We talked about, you mentioned about the money flows and we talked about the corridors that we need to have. So perhaps we need corridors to help with the philanthropic giving as well, not just investments. And I want to come to another question to build on that, actually. We're seeing with the growth of both wealth and philanthropy in the region, a major push right now, right, from countries to become philanthropic hubs. We certainly see that here in Hong Kong. I'm from Singapore, certainly see that in Singapore. And Mr. Eddie, you just mentioned that some of the things that Hong Kong is putting in place, particularly for single family offices. So Ruth, where do you see this opportunity for regulations and policies to really support donors, the social sector, and philanthropic giving if we really wanted to evolve?
So thank you for that question. We do a study every 2 years called the Doing Good Index. And Doing Good, the name came from, people in this room might remember the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business report. This is the ease of doing business, of doing good. How easy is it to give and receive philanthropic capital? And so we do this study every 2 years. It's on our website. And we say that what are the factors that government can employ to allow money to flow? Now, the two economies that do best are Singapore and Taiwan. Why? Because the government there in those two economies sees the social sector, philanthropy, nonprofits, social enterprises, as really important partners in getting the job done, in working together. Singapore, and you know this very well, has gone so far as to create, they offer a 250% tax subsidy for both individuals and corporations for charitable giving with no cap. That's the highest in the world. When you think about taxes, sure, $2.50 for every dollar you spend in Singapore is terrific, but the tax rate is low there anyway. So what does it really mean? It means the government is saying to people, we want you to do this. We want you to engage in this way, and we're putting the money where our mouth is. So the government is giving in Taiwan and Singapore a very clear and consistent message. In some of the other places that we study, the message is more muddled. And people look to those messages and say, what are you trying to say? So when a government says, yes, I'll give you 100% tax rebate, but only for the up to 30% of your income, they're essentially saying, we want you to be generous, but only this much. Why? What does it mean? So we think that policies really matter, not only in terms of regulations you can or cannot send the money out, but the messaging that government provides. We did a study called, we were commissioned to do a study by the Better Hong Kong Foundation. Hong Kong is a philanthropy hub. And we provide a series of recommendations on regulations, taxes, and cross-border, because, as Eddie has said, our strength here is that border relationship with China. So we need to think about that in terms of philanthropic capital flow, too. And I'm pleased that the FSDC, Financial Services Development Council, which is affiliated with the financial secretary, has created a task force to really look at these issues so that Hong Kong can up its game when it comes to creating an enabling philanthropic ecosystem.
Thank you. Annabel, I wanted to ask you we've got a question, and I wanted to ask you that. But before that, just building on what Ruth was saying, have you, given your experience in Europe, could you compare and contrast and what Asia can learn, perhaps, in terms of regulations and policies?
I might just build on what Ruth said, because I do agree that the corridors really do need improvement. And we've just done the work for a client who has structured an endowment in Hong Kong as a result of an IPO that will allow him to take his dividends and invest philanthropically in China in hospitals. So this is the sort of work, but it's very carefully structured to help that cross-border flow. I think that we can do more with regulation and with policy to achieve that, because I think there's a lot of desire to have that happen. That's really important. I think one thing, though, other than asking government for policy help, which is always good, I think there's a lot that families can do themselves. And what we've seen, you mentioned impact. What we've seen in Europe and Asia is a lot more sharing. I appreciate something that Ruth said, which is our Asian families are intensely private. And this giving is intensely private. It's often local. It's often done extremely carefully and quietly through their businesses or through their families. But the ability to share what they're doing, share best practices, share learnings, sometimes share investments to double the impact or triple the impact with lots of different people joining, really can amplify philanthropy. So what we encourage our clients to do is to work with us, with HSBC, and we'll pair them up with various people around the world or various families with everybody's permission to make sure that they get those learnings and that amplification, or to become part of the Giving Pledge, which is obviously the Bill Gates Foundation, etc., or to be part of Impact, or to be part, obviously, of your organization, and really learn from each other, because there's a tremendous amount of best practice and learning that can be done, particularly in Asia, where so many of these problems are really related to the SDG goals. And those SDG goals and the gap to SDG goals is greater, unfortunately, in many of these emerging economies, as you mentioned, and many of these communities. And that's a lot of the targeting and giving. And so learning best practices really can make a huge impact.
It's really creating an ecosystem, because we can't boil the ocean alone, quite honestly. I'm going to take the question from the audience, Annabel, for you. I mean, I know you've touched on a lot of this already, but what can be done, what more can be done, I guess, to alter the behavior of family-dominated corporations to be more involved in philanthropy genuinely, is the question.
You know, I mentioned the first question that we talk to any of our families or our clients about is why. And that why question is an essential part of people's personas. It's an essential part of family purpose, business purpose. It's the easiest question to ask, and it's the hardest question to answer. But what we find is, as families delve into what is their why, sometimes it's they want to teach their family values to their children, and those family values can be expressed through philanthropy. The next gen can be involved in businesses through philanthropy. They can express their passions through philanthropy. And what we find is there's a real correlation to family values, family legacy that's being expressed now, not just through the business, as those businesses diversify and grow, but actually through a core family of tenet of what do we stand for? What is our brand name? What do we want people in our communities to think of when they think of our brand? And that's really absolutely essential. There's a family in India that always comes to mind. They have a very high quality brand in their particular business, and they express that high quality brand through their philanthropy as well. So their philanthropy is all about quality. And it's really interesting to see how that's developed their business as well as developed their next gen and their interest in the business, and how that business has grown from an understanding of the correlation with philanthropy and really practiced. So that's been fantastic to see. But that why conversation is the most important conversation that we need to have with a client. And we want our clients to have amongst their own families and their own businesses.
But I do think that legacy is important. Family values are absolutely important. And I usually I'll ask the audience, everyone has heard of Rockefeller, but how many people can name the company that made Rockefeller wealthy? Maybe the people in this room are above average, can name Standard Oil, but in my experience, most people can't. And it's because of their philanthropy. It's because Rockefeller has engaged with philanthropy. I don't think Bill Gates will be remembered for an operating system that actually won't exist, won't even mean anything to our children's children. So I think philanthropy, it's very clear what the impact can be for a family, their legacy, and for their values to remain in perpetuity going forward beyond themselves.
This has been a fascinating conversation. We're out of time, but I wanted to just say one thing and get maybe one last thought from you. I know Francis Billin, the head of Christie's for Asia, has said that purchasing art is a philanthropic act. And recently I was reading in Forbes that NFTs for art and philanthropy are crypto's new act. So I wanted to ask both of you quickly, I've been told that we're out of time, maybe to share one trend that you think is philanthropy's new act, particularly for Asia.
I think we've touched on it throughout this conversation. You know, it used to be philanthropy and nonprofits were over here, for-profit investment in companies were over here, and over the past 30 years, all the terrain in between has been erupting with innovation and new ideas and new ways to use capital to solve a problem. I only see that continuing. I see that innovation. I see the use of profit, businesses to solve problems, and I think it's a very exciting time.
A slightly different tilt on that. I'd take innovation into technology, and I would look at the ability to use technology in two ways. One, to increase the transparency, the accountability, and the effectiveness of philanthropy and giving. And we're seeing great examples of our clients using AI to assess the learning of children through online tools. That's fantastic. The more people have trust, transparency, accountability, and effectiveness, the more money they give. And we want people to give money in philanthropy. That's one thing. The second side of technology is the democratization of philanthropy. Just think of GoFundMe. GoFundMe allows almost everyone to become a giver. It matches their purpose to their payments, and that, I think, is the future. When we look at the mass amount of giving and matching purpose to philanthropy in a really democratic way, we really accelerate giving beyond the families that we've talked about to the broader community.
Thank you, ladies. That was wonderful.